We've been celebrating these past 3 days in Barcelona a quite big conference with 250 people and 28 parallel sessions and 5 keynote speakers about how to reframe urban resilient sustainability. So we've been talking among academics about how to face a lot of, this is too high, to face important urban challenges. And therefore, since in this platform along the year, we're discussing how to embrace from the society different urban challenges, and in particular the climate change challenge. We're hosting tonight this double, actually, public talk about social innovation and urban challenges. And so without taking much more time, I would just be proud to announce that today we have here with us Rob Hopkins. He doesn't need introduction, I guess, right? It's a co-founder of both Transition Thoughtness and Transition Network. But we have also here Ana Huertas, who is Vice Director of the Spanish Transition Hub and the European Network of Community-Led Initiative on Climate Change and Sustainability, ECOLISE. Rob will start the talk, and then we'll pass the word to Anna, and then we have a conversation and discussion among us. So please welcome Rob.
Well, good evening, and thank you all for coming. I'm going to start by showing you a picture of my wife. Just before she got arrested last weekend in London at part of the Extinction Rebellion demonstration 2 weekends ago, which shut the main bridges in the centre of London. And Extinction Rebellion is a really interesting thing that has emerged over the last few weeks. Can you hear that strange noise as well, or is that just me?
It's the translator.
Oh, is it? No, there's a sort of. Anyway, so this was people now who were saying we are now living in a climate emergency. The time that we live in is a climate emergency, and we need to act accordingly. We need to act as though that were the case. So we are seeing there were over 100 people who were arrested that day. So I want to just start by saying this is a climate emergency. We can no longer pretend that we live in a time where somehow this is something our grandchildren will have to deal with. We have to act as though this is an emergency. And I want to start by asking you to do something. And it's something which involves you making a pair with one other person. Ideally, somebody you didn't know when you arrived here, so a stranger, to make a pair. So have a look around and choose who your partner might be. Yeah, everybody happy? You have your partner? So I'm going to show you an object, and it is an object that you see every day, most days. And the invitation is for you to have 1.5 minutes with the other person to try to think of as many alternative uses for that object as you can. They don't have to be sensible. They can be completely ridiculous. You don't have to think, but is this an economically viable product that I could get patented? They can be completely ridiculous, okay? But so you don't write them down. But just keep a tally of the number of ideas that you thought of. Okay, so you're just trying to think of as many alternative uses as possible. Is that clear? And then after 1.5 minutes, I will put my hand up, and then we will all be quiet. Okay, is that good? Go. Okay, thank you. So, could you put your hand up if you thought of more than 5 ideas? Yeah, very good. More than 10? More than 15? Whoa. More than 20? Oh. Okay, thank you. So does anybody have an idea that you thought, I really hope we get an idea to share that brilliant idea with everybody else? Any idea that you were very proud of?
We've already patented it.
Oh, okay. You are 25. Come on, let's have one of them. A foot roller. Okay, nice.
Musical instrument.
A musical instrument. Okay, very good. And over here. No? I did this in Sweden one time, and somebody said, I would use it to keep the darkness in. Which is an answer that still gives me nightmares. So the reason that I like to start with doing this is that there is something, when I look around and I see you doing this activity, it's like we have invited the imagination to come into the room. There is laughter, your eyes are very bright, you're very engaged with each other and connected. And for me, that feels like the energy that we need if we are to tackle climate change and these big issues. If when the International Governmental Panel on Climate Change say we need to see rapid, urgent and far-reaching changes to all aspects of society, it seems like most people go, oh. But actually, we should be responding like you responded to that. Ah, wow. Ooh, So in the beginning, I want to talk about this idea of imagination, because this is the only graph that I will show you all evening, I promise. And I don't show it particularly for the data. I show it because I'm interested in the story. So at the moment, we are up here, and we are surrounded by stories which tell us that this is absolutely irreplaceable. This is fantastic. This is the best it's ever been. And what we lack is the stories about this place and how fabulous this place could be. How if we were successful in reaching this place, we could have better food, better conversation, better parties, cleaner air. We could swim in the rivers. We could, we never hear those stories. All we hear is these stories. Because it's still entirely possible that we could create cities like this, where we bring the wild and the biodiversity into part of our everyday urban life. We could have cities where full of food being grown and people connecting around food and connected to the seasons. We could live in cities where we build using the materials of our bioregion, and that we thrive and make unique, beautiful spaces in cities without any cars. All of that is completely possible. But we surround ourselves with dystopian visions of the future, and it's going to be awful. But it's not. That's not a given yet. But what we do in the transition movement is to try and bring those futures alive here, now, in the present. To give people a kind of a visceral taste of what that world could be like now, in their neighborhood, in their community. However small or big those projects are, it helps to bring that different version of how the future could be alive in the present. So I'm writing a book at the moment about this idea of imagination, which for me is the way I define it. I like the definition that it is the ability to the ability to see things as if they could be otherwise. Which, if there was ever a time in history we need to see things as if they could be otherwise, this is that time. And I was inspired by a researcher in America who did some research where she gathered all of this data from something called the Torrance Test for Creative Thinking, this creativity test. And her conclusion was that imagination and IQ rose together until the mid-1990s, and then IQ kept rising, and imagination went into what she called a steady and persistent decline. And when it was published, it was on the front page of Newsweek. It was a big story. In America, there was a lot of soul-searching about, what does this mean for economic growth? What does this mean for Hollywood and Pixar? But I never heard anyone in the climate change, social justice movement say, well, what does this mean for us? Fundamentally, we are trying to help people to imagine a different future. And if people are struggling, then that's a really important piece of research. And this is, a lot of the research takes me to this little piece of the brain, which is called the hippocampus. The hippocampus is like the imagination center in our brain. It's our memory, it's our imagination, other things as well. But in research, we see that when we are very anxious, when we're very stressed, when we have trauma, the hippocampus shrinks, visibly shrinks. And people lose that ability to look at the future in kind of imaginative, hopeful, positive ways. We get stuck in the present, going round and round, which feels very much like what's happening in society now. You know, it feels like we are a society in a mild state of trauma. Certainly, coming from Brexit, Britain, it feels like that. Anyway, every day just gets more and more insane than the previous day. And I think that we kind of tend to shut down and lose that sense of looking at the future. And we hear all the time that all the focus in society tends to be about innovation. We have to innovate. I would argue that actually when your fundamental model is broken and is creating the kind of division and dangers that we see now, actually we need to be focusing on imagination much rather than innovation. And looking at how do we create the conditions in which the hippocampus can actually flourish. And this is a woman called Rosie who lives in Dundee in Scotland. And the question that has been interesting me in this research is, how do you create the conditions where the hippocampus can flourish again? So where we don't feel that sort of stress and anxiety and that sort of negative spiral. She runs a project in Dundee called Art Angel. And Art Angel works with people with mental health issues, anxiety, stress, and they work with art. So they say, when you come through our door, you're not a patient, you're not a client, you're an artist who is preparing work for an exhibition, and we support you with paints and paper and cups of tea and biscuits. And when I spoke to them, they said, fundamentally, we create safety and we create hope. And that thing of creating spaces where people feel safe and people feel hopeful is vital to creating the space, I think, for us to be able to think more imaginatively about the future. One of the things that they do is every year they do an evaluation where they ask their artists to graphically show how being part of the project has changed them. So this was somebody who'd been there for 6 months. They said, this is what I felt like before I started coming to Art Angel. This is what I feel like after 6 months in here, which feels like it is much, much more powerful than any kind of written testimonial or report. No, but this is what really intrigues me, is how, when more and more of us are feeling more and more like this, do we actually enable moving more like that? So, what I want to share with you is some learnings from the transition movement. We started transition 12 years ago. We think of it as a movement of communities that are reimagining and rebuilding the world. You'll find it in 50 countries now, thousands of places, as a bottom-up kind of an approach that says, we don't wait for anyone's permission, we get started now, here, today, with whoever else around us might be interested. So we recently had our 10th birthday, and we created this as a way of distilling what we've learned. What can we say from an experiment over that time works? So I'm going to pick out some of these and tell you some stories. So keep telling great stories. I think storytelling is such an important part of this. This is a lemon, obviously. The reason I'm showing you a picture of a lemon is I met some really interesting researchers who do this research with people where they ask them to imagine a lemon, that they're holding a lemon in their hand, and then maybe you throw the lemon up and you catch the lemon, so you get a feel for the lemon and how it feels in your hand, and then maybe you cut the lemon in half and you squeeze the lemon into a glass and you can smell the lemon juice and you can hear the drops, and maybe a little bit squirts into your eye like that. And they say, so when they work with people who are overweight and who don't exercise enough, and they say, if you help those people to imagine what it would be like when they are fit, when they are exercising, when they're feeling really good, in a way that is multisensory. Imagination isn't just a visual thing, it's multisensory, which is why they do the exercise with the lemon. So they help people to say, okay, if you imagine yourself in 6 months and you're running and you feel great and you're running and you can hear the birds and you can see the trees and you can see people and what does it feel like when you get out of the shower afterwards and you feel really fantastic? So you create a multi-sensory imagining of that. And what they find is that they're so much more effective in helping people reduce weight when you can imagine that in front of yourself. And it feels to me like that's what we try and do in transition, is to create that sort of it's like you throw a sort of a whirlpool in front of you that then draws you in towards it. This is one of the stories that I love in transition. This guy here is called Leo, and a strange fact about this story is that this man is actually Boris Johnson's brother. But we still love him because he's a really, really nice guy, this guy. As unlike Boris Johnson as you could imagine. Anyway, so he lives in London, and he is a kind of sustainability consultant person. And one day he broke his foot, so he could only move very, very slowly. First time he ever moved slowly in his neighborhood. And he started to see that there were people growing grapes in different parts of his neighborhood. He thought, I never noticed that before. And one day he met this man here who was from Italy. And he said, I don't know why I asked him, but I said to him, excuse me, do you know how to make wine? And this man said, my friend, the soles of my feet are still purple from the first 29 years of my life. So they created this idea of a project because Leo realized, he read a story in the newspaper in England at the time about a woman who died in her apartment and nobody discovered her for 6 years. And he thought, it generated lots of discussion about loneliness and isolation. And he thought, well, if I died in my house, I don't know anybody on my street. Who would find me? So his idea was, let's make some wine in the street and invite everybody on the street. And this is the event. So everybody came, all the people he didn't know, and together they all made some wine in the street. And actually, this is the following year. This is the first year's worth of wine in the bottles with the labels. I have to tell you, the wine is absolutely disgusting. But that's not the point. The wine is not the point. The point is that it's having the stories about people who find new ways to come together. And in Transition Movement, we could spend all night telling stories, and Anna will tell you some stories from Spain as well about this creating those spaces for people to come together. Seize the opportunities that present themselves. This can feel so much like a time when nothing is possible, that Amazon and the big companies have everything completely under control and we can't do anything, there's no possibilities. But there are, if we can look with our imaginative eyes at the world around us. This is in Liège, in Belgium, one of my favorite transition projects called Ceinture Alimentaire, which means food belt. So they started with a what-if question. Their question was, what if, in a generation's time, half of the food eaten in Liège, or the majority of the food eaten in Liège, was grown on the land closest to Liège? Such a beautiful question, really, really simple. And I went there 5 years ago for an event where they launched this idea. And they invited academics and food writers and chefs and baristas and anyone who cared about food at all came to this event. And then I went home and I didn't hear very much. I went again about 9 months ago, and in that time, they created 14 new cooperatives. They raised 5 million euros from local people to make those happen. They started 2 vineyards, a brewery, which I had to go and visit. You know, this is the sort of tough sacrifice I make for the transition movement. They started a farm, a business that delivered with bicycles around the city. And they started this shop called Les Petits Producteurs. It was just a space, and they painted it white. They put the food from local farmers out in boxes. They give the price the farmer wants. And the first one, which is this one, opened, and it was way more successful than anybody dreamed. So then they opened a second one. Last week they opened their third one. The mayor of Liège, who I met, he said, we used to want to be a smart city, but now we want to be a transition city. This is the story of our city now. All the land that the municipality have around the city, they are making available to Ceinture Alimentaire to grow food, to feed into this model. This man here is called Pascal, and he's the manager of Petits Producteurs. And I said to him, how far could this go? And what's the potential here? He said, I think when we have 10 shops, 10 Petits Producteurs shops, he said, and then used this beautiful word in French. I don't know if there is a word like it in Spanish. He said, I think when we have 10 shops, the supermarkets will start to fragilize. Beautiful. So it's not that we need to campaign against supermarkets You just start building something better. And over time, that becomes the new reality that we can then move across to. When I said to them, how did you raise so much money from local people? They said, don't be afraid. If you have a good story, a good narrative, people invest and get behind the idea and help to make it happen. And the exciting thing in Liège is that these projects so it started with them writing a plan. They had a vision that they wanted 10% of all the land in the area to become used for alternative agriculture. And then about 2 years later, their municipality were writing their vision document for the next 5 years of the area. They just took Centre Alimentaire's plan and put it straight into theirs. So Centre Alimentaire is now municipality policy for the whole region. Be creative and playful and open. It's one of the things I love about transition, is that it approaches topics that you might think of as being very depressing or intense, and tries to bring a playfulness to that and a creativity. This is in London, in an area of London called Tooting, where the community has no shared space. There's no square or green or like shared kind of people's place. There is one place it could be, which is here, which is normally full of buses. It's called the bus turning circle. It's full of buses just sitting there waiting for someone to say, and they just sit there. So the community had a day where they took this space over. They sent all the buses away, and they turned it into the community space that they had spent years dreaming of. There was food, and there was music, and there was coffee, there was dancing, there was things for kids to do, there was flowers. So people spent a day thinking, what if this was our space? And the conversation moved from if to when, because they spent a day living as if that had already happened. The drummers came from the local temple. I got to take my shoes and socks off on a summer's day on the grass to experience what that would be like if the space became grass. And people I saw looking at this place that they would normally just walk past here. But I heard many people say, when this is our space, what will we paint on that wall? What story will we tell about ourselves on that wall? I don't think anyone had even noticed that wall before. These kind of what-if questions is really powerful, I think. Putting care at the center. I think all too often when we do kind of community activism, we tend to be focused on the target of how do we reduce carbon emissions or whatever. But actually, how do we use that to build care at a time when our communities are becoming more and more fragmented and isolated? This is a transition group in the north of England who took a farm that their local government had just wanted to sell. They took the farm into community ownership, and they run it to provide care for people in the community through growing food, through learning how to cook food. But care is the thing that runs through it. Invest in your community. One of my projects that I'm involved in is a brewery. If you ever come to my town of Totnes, you're very welcome to come and drink the finest beer produced in the whole of the UK. And it's very much designed as a kind of a transition brewery. So we're going to be doing a thing in February where we sell the business to the community. So it becomes 100% owned by the community. And it's one of the things we see in a lot of transition groups, is creating these models where people can, rather than putting their money into a bank, and every day we turn on the news and we see all the terrible things around the world being funded by our banks. Actually, if we can fund in projects, whether it's an energy company or a food business or a shop that we've put the money into, then we start to see the world changing in the way that we want to see. And we can say, oh, I own that brewery. Enabling the community to own things, I think, is really important. Another lesson from the transition movement is, if we're really serious, transition is very ambitious. We want to change the way the places where we live feed themselves and house themselves and generate their energy. And that requires us owning assets, whether it's land or buildings or whatever. This is a project in my town where this is an old milk factory which closed in 2007, and 160 people lost their jobs. And we started a campaign then to say the community should own this place. The community should develop this place. The community should design what happens here. And after campaigning for about 7 years, this was the day we were able to invite everybody to come and hear an announcement about what was going to happen here. It's one of the, it still gives me goosebumps thinking about that day. It was really celebratory and magical. And then we ran a consultation for what should happen there, which in a town of 9,000 people, more than 5,500 people contributed their ideas. It was really extraordinary. And creating a space for people to celebrate the history of that place as well. And then we produced this plan. This was the plan that came out of what the community told us they wanted. Housing that people can afford, workshop spaces, a new space for music and so on. And the thing that was unusual about this was for the first time we used a new power that communities have where you can get a planning consent through a referendum. And you might have heard recently that the British aren't very good at referendums. But this was a local referendum where the community were invited to say, well, do you want this to go ahead or not? And 85% of the people voted said yes. So now this project will start. The important thing about it is that when it is all built, it will all be in community ownership. As a community, it will give us so much more control of where we go from there. Support each other feels like one of the things that's really important in transition is this idea of how we do things matters as much as what we do. And the kind of, in the groups that do this, we have to pay a lot of attention to how that group works, how we support each other, how we reduce the risk of burnout and exhaustion and so on. And this is a transition group in America where they run a repair cafe, not a new idea, but they're in Pasadena. So they're very close to NASA and Caltech and lots of very, very smart people. So the way that it works is they say you can bring anything. You can bring your iPad, your iPhone, your shoes, your curtains. Someone will repair it for free, but there's one condition, which is that while it's repaired, you sit in a chair opposite that person and you tell them a story about your life. You tell them a story about your life, which makes me feel, well, what are they really repairing? You know, how can we find these kind of smart ways to start to reconnect people? And in transition, we try to pay a lot of attention, like I said, to burnout, to managing how we work together. This is a thing we have in my transition town where people who are counselors and therapists offer support free of charge to the people who are at the middle of transition. And I'm sure there are people here who are activists of many different kinds who've experienced burnout, and it's a really horrible thing. So the idea is that if we can put in place these kind of structures to support each other and reduce the risk of burnout, it makes a really big difference. And weaving the community together is a really strong strand. This is a place in the Alsace in France called Ungersheim. And Ungersheim is a former mining town. And in the mid-'80s, all the mines closed and everybody lost their jobs. And they have the mayor there is called Jean-Claude Mensch. And Jean-Claude Mensch was a miner. His father was a miner. So in 2011, when he was the mayor, he saw a film called In Transition 2.0. It's a film about the transition movement. And at the end of the film, he said, let's do that, all of that. And so when you go to Ungersheim, what you see is what transition looks like when all the different threads start to come together. So they turned all the food in the schools to be 100% organic. They created a market garden on 8 hectares to grow the food, to do that, training local young people to become commercial growers of food. They created the biggest solar farm in the whole region, 5 megawatts. They created a local currency called the radish. They built this building to conserve the produce coming out of the garden to create more jobs. They did lots of different renewable energy projects. And they sold the school bus and they bought a horse instead. And so this is when I went to visit, I felt like the Queen, so taken around. There was a British flag here and the French flag here, went around the village with the horse. And I gave a talk that evening, and a man came up at the end who was about 70, and he said, Rob, this transition stuff's great, he said, really good, but that horse is a bit much. I said, what do you mean? What's wrong with the horse? He said, well, the horse feels like we're going backwards. I said, but does it? I said, I saw those kids this morning going to school, smiling from here to here. I said, I never smiled like that when I went to school in a bus. You know, there was a magic to that, which I never had, and which they'll remember for the rest of their life. They lived in a town where they were taken to school with a horse. Why can't we have a horse? Like the horse, please like the horse. So the lovely thing about there is there was a film that was made recently called Qu'est-ce qu'on attend, which means what are we waiting for? And it tells a year in the life of what's happening in Ungersheim. It's brilliant. And the thing that you see that's more important than those different projects is you see a community starting to weave itself back together again. You hear people say, I don't feel lonely anymore. You see people having more and more meals in each other's houses, glasses of wine together. You start to see this thing sort of connecting back up, and that's the real power of it, I think. This is a woman who loves the radish, and she spends the whole film going, le radis, trying to get everyone to use the local currency, and the horse, obviously. And be entrepreneurial. It's one of the things that has been a big shift over the last 5 years. I think it's 6 years in the transition movement, is to say, if we want to see new economies where we are, we need to create those ourselves. So how do we do that? And this is, for example, this is an event we do in my town every year called the Local Entrepreneur Forum, where about 400 people come together to support somebody who has an idea. So I might say, my name is Rob, I'd like to start a bakery, I need £10,000 and a building and someone to design a website. So then people would say, I've got a building you can have, I'll invest £1,000 if 5 other people here will. And we've run it for 7 years now, and there's many, many businesses now that have come through this because the community has supported them. Going back to this idea of what if, because there's something really powerful for me about a really good what if question. That question from Liège felt so like it unlocked so much. A good what if question opens up all kinds of possibilities for people to step in and go, I've got a bit for that will really help. This is a project in London called the London National Park, with a geographer called Daniel Raven Ellison, who took his son all around the UK to visit all the different national parks. And then he went back to London, and he sat down with a map, and he realised that actually 47.5% of London is green space, and 2.5% of London is blue space, lakes and ponds. This is a map of London with all the buildings taken out. So he said, if we could just make another 0.5%, then London would be half green and blue. So that's a square metre for every single person. That's definitely achievable. The beauty of the question is that it then opens up all sorts of projects then come alive in that context. All sorts of possibilities come alive in that context of reimagining London as a national park. I think it's a beautiful question. This is Dan and Hilary in London, he makes films and she's a printmaker. And they started a project when the bank closed down in their neighborhood, and they were really seeing the impacts of austerity that the government had imposed over the last 8 years. And they said, well, what if we came up with an approach to austerity that was not what people would expect? So they turned the old bank into a printing press. They called it an act of citizen money creation. And they produced these beautiful notes, which are not a currency, they're like artworks. They're like limited edition artworks. And they come in different denominations. But the people who they celebrate are the people in their neighborhood who are the people stepping up to catch the people who are falling because of austerity. So this woman is the head teacher in the primary school where they have no funding for the arts at all anymore. These guys run a project to keep young men out of gangs. This man mortgaged his house in order to start a food bank because he saw so many people hungry. And this is a family who are a Muslim family who feed 200 people 2 meals a day, every day of the year, out of their own house. So the idea is that they are selling these notes, and you buy the notes. They want to raise £50,000. The idea then is that half of that money is distributed between these charities, but then the other half they then will use on the secondary debt market to buy £1 million worth of debt and then cancel the debt. This whole idea of buying debt and cancelling debt. But it's debt that's from that neighbourhood. It's beautiful, really sort of a really imaginative way of looking at it. Just a couple of last little bits. It feels to me like if we really want to create the space in which the citizen's imagination can flourish, in which the citizen's imagination can come together and reimagine and rebuild the world, a couple of things need to be in place. This is in Mexico City. This woman, Gabriela Gomez Mont. She runs the Ministry of Imagination, in effect. Within the mayor's office in Mexico City, there is a Ministry of the Imagination. Their role is to sit within that local government and make sure that it's being as imaginative as it could possibly be. Not all municipalities are that enlightened, maybe. This is here, obviously. And for me, I always think, one of the things that has happened here in terms of the fearless cities and the municipalities, the neighborhood assemblies, is one of the things that again creates a really dynamic, that reimagining of democracy really, really helps the imagination to get a foothold. This is in Ireland, where rather than doing something really stupid, like having a Brexit referendum where you take a really complex issue and turn it into a yes-no question that nobody understands, what they did was for the big things they wanted to have referenda about, they did citizens' assemblies. So people could deliberate. They chose people randomly who came together and spent weekends meeting to deliberate and then make recommendations, again, much more mature. This is Caliacuno from Jackson in Mississippi, where they've taken a whole approach there which is about what if, bottom-up, what-if questions, using a different economic model which says we need to create cooperatives and find ways to connect the economy up in different ways. But it all comes back to that what-if question, getting the right what-if questions. And lastly, this is the city of Preston, which is a city in the north of England, pretty economically unexciting place, lots of poverty, really struggling. They had a very conventional economic development model. And then they said, well, what if we did this in a completely different way? What if we imagined the economy, our aim economically is to create as many connections with different things as possible, to create cooperatives, to create this space where the money can circulate and stay locally. Now people talk about the Preston model. They're the most improving city in the country. They're basically city-scale transition. But by changing the story, they create these kind of spaces where anything feels possible. So I'm just going to finish with a quote, and then I'm going to hand over to Anna, who's going to tell you about what's happening closer to you. So this is a quote by Neil Gaiman, who's a children's story writer. He said, "We all, adults and children, have an obligation to daydream. We have an obligation to imagine. It is easy to pretend that no one can change anything, that we are in a world in which society is huge and the individual is less than nothing, an atom in a wall, a grain of rice in a rice field. But the truth is, individuals change their world over and over. Individuals make the future, and they do it by imagining that things can be different." So thank you very much.